The first speaker will be Dr. David Tomasi, who is a professor and distinguished teaching fellow of international business at Queen's University. He completed his PhD from the Department of Political Science at Queen's University in 1999, specializing in international political economy. He holds a Master of Arts in War Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada and a Bachelor of Arts honors from Queen's University, and is a graduate of the Executive Program on Global Financial System from the JFK School of Government at Harvard University. He brings an expertise in international political economy, energy, geopolitics, and corporate strategy. His perspective will help frame Venezuela's situation within global energy markets and assess implications for Canada and an academic and strategic standpoint. Dr. De Tomasi is also the author of Profits and Power, Navigating the Politics of Geopolitics of Oil, among other publications. Our second speaker will be Professor Gordon Holden. Professor Gordon Holden is the Director Emeritus of the China Institute at my institute, the University of Alberta, and he's a professor of political science and adjunct professor of the Alberta School of Business, also at the University of Alberta. He is also an adjunct professor at the Institute for South China Sea Studies. He was born in Calgary and attended the University of Calgary, where he received a BA, and subsequently did graduate work at Carleton University in Ottawa and attended the University Nacional in Lima, Peru. Professor Holden has joined the Foreign Service in 1976 and had a very distinguished foreign service career, being posted to Havana, Hong Kong, Warsaw, Beijing, and was the executive director of the Canadian Trade Office in Taipei from 2004 to 2006. And he joined the University of Alberta shortly thereafter to head the China Institute. And I can say from my personal experience, has done a very excellent job in doing that. It was always a pleasure to watch you, Gordon, in action. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Professor De Tomasi.
Well, thank you, Moyne, and thank you, Gordon, and thank you, Justin, for joining me on this panel. And indeed, thank you to all the participants for spending your lunch hour with us here today. Thank you also for the introduction, Moyne. I'll give a little bit more color to it. I grew up in Cochrane, Alberta, for those of you that are Alberta born. And this was when Cochrane was 3,000 people, not the 30,000 we have now. And even then, obviously, oil and gas and energy was very much core to what the province was doing and how it identified itself. Time when Peter Lougheed was prime minister, or premier, excuse me, and was having lots of interesting interactions with the individuals who were running our federal government. When I moved to central Canada to pursue my graduate degrees and eventual employment, I realized that what I knew about energy was just part of the mix, about how important it was and how critical it was to human flourishing. That knowledge was not widely shared by my compatriots in central Canada, who did not grow up with those sorts of things, didn't know much about the industry. And over the last 10 years, I've noticed, clearly there's a very powerful element that was against carbon-based energy, largely because of environmental concerns that people had. And I've been trying to talk about how we can develop our energy sources with keeping an eye to this for a couple of decades now. Now, Professor Moyne talked about the first book. I'm currently writing a second book, which is entitled, tentatively, Canada as an Energy Superpower, Why We Should Be It and What It Will Take to Become It. And to think about that, one of the things I'll just summarize by saying is that energy now has been and is a geopolitical commodity, and one that Canada is blessed to have an abundance of. Now, we've had that for a long time, but I don't think people saw it in that way, as more a view of an economic commodity, and it was run by economic principles, which over the last decade have been a little bit hard, largely because of people's general reluctance to endorse carbon. Today, however, that it's an energy is now a commodity that is geopolitically important, something our former Prime Minister Harper and our current Prime Minister Carney have both said, one of the few things they've said together, means that we can actually do something that perhaps wasn't possible before. Now, secondly, the trade dependence on the U.S. has been actually an enormous advantage for Canada over the past 40 years, to be next door to a country that is the biggest economy in the world and generally for a long period of time has been open to free trade and integrated production chains within Canada has been enormously beneficial to us. But clearly, this is something now that is on the docket with the upcoming renegotiations of the free trade agreements in North America, and something we should probably discuss in a bit more detail. But energy is a pretty key component to that relationship. And the third geopolitical point I'd like to argue of the four I'm going to make is that Canada has some interesting choices to make as a middle power and trying to spread our influence beyond and our connections beyond just the United States. Because if you take a look at the world today, and if it's devolving into a more mercantilist, more power-based world, you have two big centers of economic power, which is the United States and China, and Europe rapidly trying to be Sue. But there's big chunks of power being in other places, and they have very different views about energy. The United States is doubling down on a carbon-based agenda, and this is something that we can take advantage of. But it also see in Europe, they still and are likely to be continue to be worried about energy transitions, and so is China. So I think it is important for Canada to geopolitically and Alberta to consider that the various divergence of these centered powered blocks might lead us to have a kind of a more nuanced and enveloping and wider ranging energy policy where we can take advantage of each one and thereby enhance our own final interests. And finally, I think the message I would say about Canadian energy before I turn it over to Golden is I think we have a unique Canadian message to give to the world about how we view our energy. Mr. Trump has talked a lot about energy dominance. We know what Mr. Putin does with his energy and how he uses it. We have a message to send that we can help provide energy security and abundance to the rest of the world, and we can produce that energy in a way that's cognizant of and respective of Canadian values. And that if we were to do that and continue to do that, regardless of the workings around us, I think we will have a safer world, a more economically prosperous world, and one that is actually more in line with the interests that we as Canadians carry in terms of how we conduct our economic affairs as well as our geopolitical ones. And I think I'll stop there. That's about 4 minutes, maybe a bit more, and hand it over to my colleague Gordon, but that's what I would start with.
Thank you. And before Gordon, you start, I'll just mention that you can type your questions in the chat. There's a Q&A box at the bottom. You can type your questions in there as we go along. We'll have a chance for the audience to ask questions later on, but if you want to type it in now, you can also type it in as we're going along in case you want to record it and not forget. But I'll turn it over to you, Gordon.
Well, thank you much, and I'll try and stick to my 4-minute allotment. I'd thank Alberta Council for this opportunity to speak to my fellow Albertans. There's no doubt that geopolitical risks have increased sharply over the past year, not unconnected to the election of Donald Trump as U.S. president. Wasn't the only reason, but there's a major contributor. For many years, during my postings in China, and then when I was in federal government, I spent 22 years working exclusively on China. And in that key bilateral relationship, U.S.-China, the most important bilateral relationship on earth, I was concerned about the stability of the Chinese leadership. But in the last couple of years, I've actually become more concerned about the stability, predictability of U.S. relationship. In the long run, I still have issues about the Chinese leadership because it's focused on one individual who's going to be 79 by end of his third term. If we look at the Canada-China relationship, which really began to be stressed in the middle of the second decade, in that period about 2015, 2016, if you look at public views of China, they were declining, more positive in Alberta, but generally more negative elsewhere in the country. But then in 2018, with the arrest of the two Michaels, things went into a sharp decline, for which they continued really bumping along the bottom until about 2024. But by 2024, we saw on the Chinese side public and private interest in reviving a relationship and repairing it. China is an immensely pragmatic foreign country in terms of foreign policy, economic policy. But it was only on the Canadian side, with the change of prime ministers, the assumption of Mr. Carney to prime ministership, that we saw a keen interest in and diversifying our trade, rehabilitating that China relationship. And that visit, the first in January this year, the first since 2017, which was a very unsuccessful visit by Prime Minister Trudeau, where the idea of a free trade agreement fell apart. This visit was successful. And we saw some particular short-term payoffs in terms of EVs. The agreement to allow almost 50,000 EVs at a low tariff rate of 6.1 versus 100%, which had been applied, and on canola, which is of special importance to Western Canada and to Alberta. The tariffs would go down to a combined rate of about 15% starting on March the 1st. And that's a $4 billion market, more or less, for Canadian producers. And it's a big drop from a combined tariff rate around 85%. And we're hopeful that canola meal, lobsters, crabs, peas will all be removed from discriminating tariffs around March the 1st, at least until the end of this year. If you look at those, it's probably about $3 billion of new export orders. Now, before we get carried away in enthusiasm, China actually has an economy the same size as the United States, or larger, or smaller. It all depends on how you count it. If you go purchasing power parity, it's larger. If you go by nominal GDP, it's smaller. But the growth rates are still in the range of about 5% per year, approximately, if you accept Chinese statistics, which I do with asterisks and some other considerations. But in terms of energy, let's just focus on energy for a moment. We are quite compatible. Canada wants destination diversity, so we're not as heavily dependent, almost entirely sending our oil to the United States, 88% or something of that order. And China wants diversification of supply, even before this most recent mess in the Middle East, where China, being the principal taker of Iranian oil, could take a huge hit. The attractiveness of Canadian oil is significant, and we have seen in the last 18 months a sharp uptake in Chinese importation of oil. China is the number one importer of oil, 11 billion barrels a day. Even if half their energy is produced by coal and their renewables are growing very quickly, they still need oil and will need oil for the foreseeable future. So the market is there. And then finally, I'll finish on one item. When I went to the China Institute, I started a tracker of Chinese investment, which in my opinion is still the best tracker of Chinese investment. It's available by subscription. And that investment peaked in the second decade, particularly with the purchase of Nexon, then the largest purchase ever. It then slumped dramatically. But Prime Minister Carney has said clearly Chinese investment, including in energy and in the oil sands, is welcome again. Prime Minister Harper put a fence around the oil sands. Fence has now been removed. And I'm getting questions from the media, as including today. Will this mean likelihood of significant Chinese investment in our energy sector, or even a pipeline? And I have views on that as well. I'll stop there because I think I'm already at about 5.5 minutes. Apologies.
No, that's great. And this perfect segue to get into some discussion. I apologize. I see I'm getting some feedback that there's a lot of feedback. We just upgraded our systems here, so that's of course one of the byproducts of when we change our systems, unfortunately. So I apologize. But let's delve into the EVs and canola and what's going on in Venezuela, well, what's going on in Mexico too. But with these recent developments with respect to canola and EVs, and of course what happened in Venezuela, perhaps the two of you can talk about, what's the most important sort of, in your opinion, geopolitical development right now for Alberta decision makers, and what should industry be paying attention to? And there's a question, and I'll tack it onto that. Trump is clearly not very thrilled about some of these meetings we've had with the Chinese, and so if you want to mix that in and see where that goes. Why don't we have you go first, Gordon, and then we'll go back to David.
Sure. I'll take the question straight on and try and add a little bit to it. There's no doubt that the Americans are unhappy about our efforts to diversify our trade and investment to China. And quite frankly, that 100% tariff on EVs, that was in direct imitation of what the Americans had done. And so this government, federal government, or provincial government, is a really tough decision to make. How important is it to diversify by reaching out to China, given that there's going to be some negative feedback from the United States? Despite this current situation, we're still looking at about 5% of Alberta and Canada's exports to China, as opposed to the United States, which is in the range in the high 70s or 80. So one has to be careful that we're not skewing or damaging that primordially and existentially important U.S. trade. On the other hand, to go on indefinitely, so dependent on U.S. trade, has its own risks. Australia has number one trading partner, 40%. Australia, they got a diversity. Japan, US, we're in this uni-market lock. And I think personal view, I think we have to move out of that. And watch in April when President Trump goes to China, watch for deals made with Xi. For example, soybeans, which competes directly with canola in terms of animal feed. And this, what I call directed trade, where the Chinese will be obliged to purchase X amount. They don't always follow through, but at least in theory. I think we have to be in there competing in those markets. And China is half of the Asian economy. And gradually, over the course of the next few decades, the majority of the world's economic activity will be in Asia. 2/3 of the population is there. I can imagine eventually 2/3 of the world's economy will be in Asia. So long term, for us and for the United States, Asia is unavoidable, and we pay a big price were we to decide to have our trade relationship with Asia dictated out of Washington.
David?
Sure, I'll build on some of the things Gordon said, and I'll dive in a little bit on Venezuela. Yeah, when you take a look at the numbers, the amount of extra trade we might be getting from China from that previous agreement is pretty minuscule. We're talking about 50,000 EVs. That's great, but Canada sold 1.9 million vehicles last year. We're talking 75 to 80% of our trade has been with the United States and will continue to be simply for facts of geography. So the idea that Canadian leaders should not and cannot go out into the rest of the world, talk to them, and seek mutual accommodation on the economic front where they see it seems to me a pretty simple one. And even a business person like Mr. Trump might see that behind closed doors, and this is really kind of small. Secondarily, I think we've got to be careful of our verbiage just generally in terms of how we view things. I think we focus too much on what Mr. Trump and use him as a proxy for the entire American populace. Now, while there is clearly a big chunk of American populace that believes as he does, there's also a big chunk that does not. And increasingly, we have to think, I think, and then we can talk about this more in the discussion, we have to think a couple, 3, 5 years down the line when Mr. Trump is no longer part of the picture. And what will be coming after him. And that's something we could perhaps talk a little bit about in this webinar. Third thing I'll say very quickly is about Venezuela. Yeah, it was a very impressive military operation to get Mr. Maduro, but I am skeptical that it's going to change much in the short to medium term, 3 to 5 years, of how Venezuela is actually going to work. There's still the apparatus that supported Maduro is still there. There are still enormous challenges in trying to get the Venezuelan oil sector up and running. The cost associated with a Venezuelan barrel of oil and getting it to market is extremely high. The take of the Venezuelan government is high, and there's almost nothing left over for really serious capital investment to clean up the mess 15 years of neglect have created. So snatching one guy does not change all of that. Now, and to think that large investors are going to suddenly pile into Venezuela simply because of that change. Even the leader of ExxonMobil has said that's probably not going to happen. We're going to need to see a lot more. So that is a longer term project. We would like to see the follow up from Mr. Trump. I'm not quite sure Mr. Trump is big on follow ups long term, but we shall see. So I am not as worried about the Venezuelan case, and I would just caution that when we talk about Mr. Trump, we have to see a bit beyond him, as hard as that sometimes is.
There's a question in the chat, and I'll try to. So the question is, how do members of the panel suggest Albertans navigate the unstable rhetoric from the President of the United States while being focused on planning future economic endeavors? And I'll add to that, how well positioned is Alberta and Canada right now to navigate that growing competition between the major powers like the United States and China? And maybe I'll start with you, David, in this one.
Sure. Yeah, I'll let Gordon talk about the China side. One of the things I will argue is that geopolitical strength is a product of internal unity as much as it is having, economic and military strength, which we're busy building. And right now, Canada has been, since Mr. Carney became Prime Minister, talking about a Team Canada approach. And I think Alberta has been cautiously optimistic that this will mean that he will endorse things his predecessor never would and address challenges Alberta has talked about forever and have never been addressed. But the clock is ticking a bit here. We have a memorandum of understanding, but no one's seen any shovels in the ground yet on the new projects. There's been no rescinding of certain rules. There's been continual fights at the Supreme Court about whether or not Bill C-69 is constitutional. We can argue about whether it is or not, but it's an absolutely awful symbol to the rest of the world that says Canada does not have its regulatory house in order. So why should we can't invest until we know who's in charge of what. And, and this gets into your earlier question, Moyne, whether or not we're going to Chinese investment. Well, they are investors who look for regulatory certainty just like anybody else. And so we have to have our domestic house in order. What I think Mr. Trump will do, and this is my final point, is he can, if he wants, play up the regional interests of Canada in the upcoming free trade negotiations. There's 3 or 4 big trade issues that always happen with the Americans with Canada. Energy actually isn't one of them. It works pretty well. One is softwood lumber, which is the interests of BC. One is steel and automobiles, which is the interests of Ontario, and one is supply management in the dairy sector, which is Quebec. Right. And as Mr. Trump may press Mr. Carney on those 3 issues that affect BC, Ontario, and Quebec, will Alberta's interests suddenly be shoved back behind those 3 to get this deal that we say we want free trade? I would argue if he does that, Mr. Carney does that, he's going to engender an awful lot of anger in Alberta and a lot of feeling like, hey, you did it again. You sold us down for the interests of somebody else. That would be a challenging thing to navigate for Mr. Carney. Over to Gordon.
Gordon?
Sure. Well, I think it's the nature of extremely large economies vis-a-vis their neighbors. They like the hub and spoke approach, which tends to mean that Canada has difficulty in Washington explaining its interest in China markets, China investment. In the CUSMA, negotiated during Trump's first term, there's a specific chapter that precludes any of the 3 partners from having a free trade agreement with a non-market economy. I mean, if you hold that piece of paper up to the light, the watermark says China. We mean China. Expect in the next round of negotiations that the Americans will be looking hard at whatever we are intending to do with China and pushing back hard. My own experience, however, is that And we'll see this, I think, when Trump goes to Beijing in April. America has very ambitious goals in its trade with China. We have to be wary that we're not end up being forbidden to do the things that America's doing under the radar or openly. We need to find ways to quietly boost our trade with Asia. Now, here I'm going to be a wild-eyed optimist, but talking privately with a previous Chinese ambassador in Washington, he said, "Look, Gordon, we got 4 times the population of the United States. America's panicked about the idea that our economy might be as big as theirs. Why couldn't it, in the fullness of time, be, say, twice as large?" Now, that's looking forward, not a decade or two, but perhaps 3 or 4. But given the speed of the Chinese development over the last 30 years, slowing but not stopped, imagine it's 2060, say, and Alberta's looking at the world, and the Chinese economy is twice the size of the U.S. economy. I'm not saying this necessarily come to pass, but to continue a sole focus on the U.S., despite our dependence, to me, would be risky. And that wouldn't go for energy. It goes for, especially for agriculture, where China feeds itself with difficulty, where the middle class is now larger than the entire U.S. population, and the Chinese really put a lot of importance on food. They want high quality, good food, and they'll pay top prices. And that's why they're the only country on earth that will buy huge quantities of Canadian canola. We can't ignore that market. We just have to be very deft and sophisticated in how we manage Washington, still allowing ourselves flexibility vis-a-vis Asia. Over.
Well, that's great. Just a reminder to the audience, you can type questions in the Q&A box. I will open it up to the floor in a bit, but since we're having such a good discussion here, I'd like to maybe ask my panelists, what do you think, based on what you just described? It sounds like you're describing some opportunities, and David. So what are the opportunities for Alberta and Canada that could emerge from these shifting global dynamics? Maybe I'll start with you, Gordon, since you were talking about canola and
Sure. I'll try and be really, really short. At the end of the day, it's not governments that makes trade. It's businesses and consumers that makes trade. So what Carney and other leaders can do, be it Washington, be it the U.S. or China, is to clear the way, hopefully, of barriers, lower tariffs, get rid of quotas. But at the end of the day, China is an immensely competitive market with a degree of domestic protection and canola competition from other countries, including South America and including Australia, etc. So our business people have to get out there and hustle. Our government, the Alberta government can help, the federal government can help, but it's a massive, complex place. Regions, individual provinces with populations, sometimes a couple of cases triple the size of our own population. You can't do it all at once. But I would argue that having some China expertise, some China market expertise is critical. But you can't just sit and wait for the federal government or the provincial government to solve all your problems. They can give you advice, but we've got to scramble. And I have a feeling that we've been so spoiled by that long, great access to the United States. Don't take offense at this, my fellow Albertans. But here's one of my sayings. Albertans born on third base and think they've hit a triple. Over.
I love that's a good line.
Yeah. David?
I could easily expand it to the country, although the rest of the country doesn't have the energy resources. We have been somewhat spoiled in having access. I mean, there's a couple of things. I'll just back up a little bit. I've been looking at this professionally for 35 years, and I would like to convey to the audience a couple of things that I've seen in that time. One is you're going to see a lot of newspaper headlines and others talking about this unprecedented era of risk that we are currently in and the volatility. It is always risky and volatile and always has been. Like there's never been a time in that 35 years that I've been studying this where it's been nice and calm and we can just do whatever we want and the returns will just come. And it may be for parts of Canada because we've had this cozy relationship with the United States, but it hasn't been for the rest of the world. They scramble. And I see that in my MBA classrooms and for the last 10 years, who are full of Indians and Chinese students until we put caps on international students, more than anxious to go abroad and learn as much as they possibly could about, and I'm not sure the Canadians have done as much reciprocating, in terms of going out into the world and trying to drum up those opportunities Gordon was talking about. The second thing I would think the opportunities are is I think we should be proud of our roots. This is a chance to say one of the things I've seen in the last 35 years is that there's been a number of federal governments who seem to give off an air of being ashamed of the fact that Canada has natural resources. Agriculture, oil and gas, mining, wood, and these are so 20th century. This is not where the heart and soul of the economy ought to be. It ought to be in AI and big tech and social media. Now, I think that's a mistake. I mean, the world needs what we have, and we'll buy it, as Gordon was talking about earlier, is looking for the very things that we have, and we'll always need them. So I think we could have a conversation about the value natural resources bring to the country. And thirdly, this is not a low-tech business. If we can really figure out ways to capture carbon effectively and find ways to do it with it monetarily well, we can create technologies that lower carbon emissions. We can create target that burn. These are things that are high-tech things just in the energy sector that are sellable. Right now, for example, the topic of climate change has receded a bit in the global conversation, but it's not dead. And there's a number of people that still care very much about it. And it'll come back. And people, if we can show them that you can use carbon in a more economically and environmentally friendly way through Canadian-born technology, you can probably sell that. So those are the opportunities I think I have of rediscovering some of the core strengths that we have and being proud of them rather than being, well, we really wish we were like Silicon Valley. I mean, okay, but it's going to be really hard to copy that. The scale of the Americans on that is just so enormous.
Well, this actually a good segue into two questions that are in the chat. So I'll combine them and pose them to you, David, and then Gordon. So I'll call them the theme of diversification. One question is, much has been said about China as an emerging market, especially for energy and agriculture. What about India? So how about we think beyond US, China, what about other countries like India? And then another question says, in the context of canola, what is your take on domestic diversification to biofuels? So, diversification in geographic customers and in terms of domestic products. Maybe I think, David, you were last, so we'll send it back to you and then we'll go to Gordon. Yeah.
So I'll talk. What was the first part of it again?
India. Why are we talking just about China and US? What about other countries and other parts of the world? Not just India, but in Middle East and so on.
I don't know about Gordon, but I will say this about China. For an emerging market, it looks pretty emerged. Like it's been, this is the classic complaint about China in trade discussions, was that it keeps classifying itself as an emerging market and therefore needed all these other supports in trade and the non-market side to allow it to catch up. It seems to have done that pretty well. And I'm not quite sure people are buying that argument anymore, given China's leadership across a number of sectors and sophistication in so many of them. But there are other countries. If you take a look at, as was mentioned, at India's energy consumption today, it looks an awful lot like China's energy consumption did in the year 2000. It's almost identical in terms of the amount and in terms of the composition of oil, coal, natural gas, and others. And India is a very ambitious country as well and wants to get its place in the world and under dynamic leadership. So there's every reason to suspect that it too will require large imports of energy from wherever it can get it for as long as possible. And this is where I like the idea. I'll stop in that. Well, after India, then you're going to have Africa, which is another, it's just getting going. There's various chunks of the world in developmental stages. I don't like the Canadian habit of thinking carbon energy, either or it or renewables. The world will need every bit of energy from every source it can possibly get for as long as any of us are going to be around to care. Given the desire of people to improve their lives, the fundamental energy. So the fact that we sell a lot of carbon doesn't mean we can't sell a lot of small modular nuclear reactors. And doesn't mean we can't involve, we should play across as many energy spectrums as we can because the world, what I see in the last thing I'll say is a lot of predictions have become politicized in that they are done in a way to capture a picture of the future that reinforces something that people want to believe ideologically. The IEA, I would argue, had been captured the past number of years on this front, was trying to produce an energy future that was very focused at zero. And now they're coming back towards the center saying, well, that's going to take a while. We got to figure out carbon for a while yet. And so I think that we should think about energy as not either or, as all of, and that, we almost have a moral duty to help provide it to people that don't have it. Because you still have 2 billion people in the world that are cooking fuel, their dinner on animal dung and living in very it's not right either. So all of these things play into an all energy source, in my view. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Gordon for his thoughts.
I'll just say a couple of things about India. It's taken India a long time to get its game together. Super protectionist and underinvestment infrastructure. Chinese model was very different. Centrally managed, but a relatively open compared to India, and spending lavishly on infrastructure. I was deeply skeptical at the time in the 90s. I'd walk along those docks, which were kilometers long in southern Chinese ports. They're all very busy now. It was money well invested in overall. But if I look at the size of the economies today, Chinese economy roughly $20 trillion, US, India around 4 trillion, Southeast Asia around 4 trillion. Southeast Asia's economy is easier in some ways to do business there, but of course it's divided into 10 or 12 countries, depending how you count them. When Canada came out in 2018 with the Indo-Pacific strategy, totally avoid talking about China, talked up India and Southeast Asia. But one of the problems, I think, Canadian business people that go to Southeast Asia, a little bit less to India, immediately when you land, you're going to be engulfed in supply chains running to China. 10 of the 12 ASEAN country members have China as primary trade partner, as does Taiwan, as does South Korea, as does Japan, so that you can go to other parts of Asia. You can run, but you can't hide from the China dimension. And so for that reason, I think it's not a China or something else. It should be probably China and India, China, Southeast Asia. But they're all lots of economic opportunity. If you're a smaller Alberta company, you could build a really niche market share in Malaysia and be quite happy there. It depends, I think, on size, and you can't do it all at once. Another question could be on the investment thing, but that's for a separate issue. Over.
Great. Why don't we've got 2 more questions in the audience, and so I'll combine those 2 just so we can. One is it time for Alberta to consider developing a strategic oil and gas reserve through storage in order to better respond to geopolitical and domestic risks that impact Alberta directly? And then there's a question says, is Minister Carney's approach to empowering medium-sized countries to band together to improve their trade power viable in the short term and long run? So why don't we, if you want to tackle one or both of those 2 questions, I'll start with you, Gordon.
Sure. What was the second one again? I'm sorry, the second part?
Second one was, is Prime Minister Carney's approach to empowering medium-sized countries to band together to improve their trade power viable in the short term and long term?
Yeah. Okay. Well, on the first one, I'm going to set aside the question of strategic reserve and kick that back to our other panelists. However, I would flag the fact that you don't have to sell oil to China to be profoundly impacted. They are the number one importers of oil, 11 billion barrels per day. If the Chinese economy were to falter, if they for somehow did not no longer needed to import large amounts of oil, the impact on the price, given it's a globally fungible commodity, would sharply contract. So it's a factor there. Whether you have a pipelines running to the coast, you're exporting to them, it will affect the overall price. So you can't ignore what they're doing. On the Carney thing, it sounds good, but I'm skeptical. The mechanics of medium-sized countries combining strategy. We're in a world right now where major powers, largely US and China, to a lesser extent, the Russia and the EU, dominate international trade and geopolitics for that matter. Try and get, say, the medium-sized countries, the South Korea, Australia, Turkey. You include Italy, maybe in the UK. Try to get to them to cooperate in a pragmatic fashion with industrial strategies, defense strategies, fine, but broadly, often these countries are competitors. We compete with Australia across the board. So I wasn't overwhelmed by the workability of middle-sized powers working closely on trade issues. Political collaboration, perhaps, but trade agreements, arrangements, much more difficult to do. Over.
David?
Sure. Yeah, the idea of a strategic petroleum reserve is an interesting one. It gained a lot of popularity when, mainly after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the price shock of 1973, when you saw the dependence on imported oil, particularly of Western economies in Western Europe and North America. Now, the idea is to have a reserve in case you were blockaded or couldn't get access to places where you had formerly relied upon it. You can keep your economy going until you can find it. Another one. That was before the United States discovered the shale oil revolution. And that was before, I mean, it wasn't before, but we didn't exploit it as much, the fact that we have Alberta oil sands. So I'm not entirely convinced Canada would need to develop a strategic petroleum reserve. We already do. It's called the oil sands. We have one. And we just don't have it in barrels or liquid form, but we could do that if we wanted to. I would probably argue that to do that would require some public help, some public money to spend that money. I would argue that if that was the case, that public money could be better spent in reducing the risk and helping to create the conditions for egress pipelines for Canadian oil and gas to the coasts. I'm very skeptical that a private sector oil company, and Enbridge has come out and saying this, can handle that risk all by itself or is willing to do it, given the history they have had of pipeline projects being proposed, being allowed, and then suddenly shut down. We were talking a little bit earlier about the riskiness of previous eras. Well, the people at TransCanada that tried to build Keystone Pipeline for 15 years they know about risk. I mean, this is so. I think we should, if we're going to spend public money, we should do on something that could, quite frankly, generate a public return. And which egress routes could, and that would enhance our sort of capacity to sell abroad. That's where I'd put our money is in doing that. The second thing about this liberal, the multilateral order is over. I'm not sure I buy it completely. If the multilateral liberal order was so weak that one man could destroy it by himself, then it was never very strong to begin with. But I would argue that Mr. Carney's speech pointed out some really things. It was never a perfect order, and it was clearly the case where more powerful countries, when they wanted to, would exert their power in it. It's a little bit like saying, it's like the multilateral liberal order was like a dog walking on its hind legs. It wasn't done perfectly, but the fact that it was done at all is a bit of a miracle. I mean, that you had a rules-based order in trade and investment, and that people most of the time, paid attention to the rules, was actually kind of impressive feat given the history of the global economy and the tendency for mercantilism to reassert itself from time again. And I would argue that although frayed and hurt, and clearly there are, we have to have a clear eye on these things. There are people and countries and leaders around the world, including middle powers, who like the rule, having a stable rule set and want to see it happen and want to endorse it. And I would argue there's chunks of the United States that does too. And then I see this across the border. Like there's a lot of people in Michigan that like having clear-headed rules about trade because they've made a lot of money from it. So I don't think it's completely dead, but I do think we have to have a clear idea of when it can work and when it cannot. And the final thing I'll say about Mr. Trump is, although he's an extreme case in how he does things, there's nothing in his electoral platform one can't find by reading previous U.S. presidents and U.S. history. The country has always had a very strong streak of protectionism. Alexander Hamilton was the biggest one. And lots of folks are worried about foreign competition, and lots of, I mean, he isn't inventing things that the U.S. cares about. He isn't making it up. This is long-standing grievances that a chunk of the country has. So I would argue that those risks will not go away once he does. There will always be a strand of Americans that believe the way he does and thinks the way that he does. And they just have to be managed. It's not as if that risk is going to be taken once he exits the scene.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. We're getting close to the end of our time. So what I will do now is invite the two of you to give some closing remarks. And maybe as you do, if you can think about one issue that will matter most in the next 12 months, and flag that in your closing comments. And we'll start with you, Gordon. Give you a chance to conclude, and if there's anything you think is coming.
Sure, I'm pleased to do that. I'll add one thing I didn't really touch upon, but I think is important. It's been a research focus for me for the last 10 years, and that is incoming investment from China, which could be called the rise and fall of Chinese investment. The United States is a debtor country. They are a significant investor globally. China has debt as well, but it tends to be governmental and private. It's Chinese owing Chinese money in Chinese currency. But they have this pot of roughly $4 trillion of foreign exchange, and they are prepared to spend it. And they are super active in other parts of Asia, number one, South America, Africa, and Canada, although the investment had slumped. The question is, will it change? Because we need it, and that investment is not going to come principally from the United States, and we can't generate enough with such a small population, with such huge resources. And as my counterpart has noted, we need not be ashamed of a resource economy. China has the capacity and has shown in the past their willingness to make big investments in natural resources. We have to have, though, a clarification of what is allowed and what isn't. What is a security risk and what isn't? It becomes sometimes a little bit exaggerated. We turned down investment in a glass float plant in Kitchener. This would have, for the first time in our history, allowed us to produce huge glass panels within this country as opposed to importing them. But it became a question of, well, there's going to be Chinese technicians there, there's water. You can blow up security to cover any possible set of circumstances. I think we need a hard-nosed examination of our investment criteria. And I think that this government federal government will do so. And I predict you're going to find a willingness on the federal and on the Alberta side to tolerate targeted investment, particularly greenfield investment in our economies in a Canadian economic world where we have too little investment sources. I think that's going to be fairly critical. And beyond that, I would agree with my counterpart. Uncertainty is the nature of the world. On the energy side, I would submit that we're in a point of uncertainty that goes back. You'd have to go back a few decades to find something equivalent. And they need to diversify. I personally find it hard to argue against that, particularly when our southern neighbor will be aggressively pursuing its own economic interests in Asia and elsewhere. Over.
David?
Sure. The question was, what do I fear over the next 12 months is most significant? Well, a couple of things I'll preface that with. One is my guess is the period of the shock and awe of the Trump administration is drawing to a close. I mean, over the last year, it's been nothing but headline after headline after headline after effort. And now you're starting to see slowly the resistance to those extreme efforts starting to pop up, including the recent Supreme Court decision on the Trump tariffs. Hasn't stopped everything. And now it's the dull, grinding work of trying to manage the world. And I'm concerned about is that Canada will revert back to the insularity we've mentioned earlier. That we will simply say that the last year and a half has been a bad period, but a unique one due to one individual. And, we're now, it wasn't that bad. And we can go back to being our fairly divided, selves and not take seriously the fact that the country needs an economic strategy because this can happen again. I worry about that creeping back in, that these patterns of thought about how we develop our economy are so ingrained. And then I worry about if that happens, there are people who are very, very frustrated in Alberta and clearly are expressing that in terms of referendums that we're supposed to be the best country in the world, and 20% of Albertans or whatever many say they want to leave. Kind of strange. But you got to give them a reason not to think that way. And one of the things is, we are interested in developing. So I worry that our older patterns will reassert ourselves. Complacency will set back in. We won't do the hard work of going after Chinese investment or diversifying or building pipelines. And we'll be right back where we started without having, really been able to take advantage of the fact that we're under threat and we should do something about it. That's my concern.
Well, thank you both for a very exciting discussion over the lunch hour, and thank you all for who attended. This seminar is being recorded and will be posted later on our website. And both Gordon and David have kindly agreed. If any of you in the audience have some questions to follow up, so we will post a graphic with their contact information. And you can, or if you contact us, we can also pass that information along. Stay tuned for more seminars. If you saw this, here we go. We're going to have the graphic up in a second. Do I need to double click? Oh, there we go. Yes. So there's the contact info. And so if you wish to follow up with any of them, any of other questions, feel free to do so, or you can email me and I can send it along. As I said, this is recorded, so if you don't need to worry about taking this down, this will be on our recording. Stay tuned for more seminars in the future, and thank you all for taking your lunch break and to listen to our discussion today. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.